Alright, so this is Luke Marino's fastener lesson. So first of all, for length of screws. So the length of the screw is usually measured from the base of the head to the end of the threads on normal screws. So this type, any round-headed screw or bolt, you go from the end of the head to the end of the thread. But for countersunk screws or anything with a flared head, you go from the end of the widest part of the flare to the end of the screw. So for anything that's countersunk or flat topped, you normally do this. There are some exceptions like oval head screws where you go to the widest part of the flare to the end and you still have the rounded cap, but those aren't very common in cold metal work. Next would be for measuring screw and bolt diameter. So screw and bolt diameter is usually measured by the thread diameter, which is the width of the outside of the thread. And then you can also measure the shank diameter, which is the diameter of the part of thread that isn't, or the part of the bolt that isn't threaded, or you can measure the root diameter, which is the width of the inner thread. Thread pitch in the standard system is number of inches or threads per inch. So a regular coarse threaded bolt would be 10 threads per inch on a standard bolt. 16 threads per inch would be a fine bolt. This is a fine bolt. There's 16 threads per inch. This is 1 inch right here from end to end, and there's 16 threads. In the metric system, the distance between crests of adjacent threads is how you measure if it's coarse or fine or the thread pitch. So in the metric system, right here, you have the diameter in millimeters multiplied by the distance between threads in millimeters. So a 1.25 millimeters per thread would be a coarse type bolt. 1 millimeter would be a fine type bolt. So now we go to bolt strength or grades. So no markings on a bolt would be a grade 2 bolt, which has a 55,000 psi tensile strength, or 55,000 psi proof load from 1/4 inch to a 3/4 inch bolt, and a 33,000 psi proof load of 3/4 to 1.5 inch. So then you have a grade 5 bolt like this bolt, and that would be a 85,000 psi proof load from 1/4 inch through 1 inch, and a 74,000 psi proof load from 1 to 1.5 inch. And then you have the grade 8 bolts, which have 6 lines across the head, which have a 120 psi proof load from 1/4 inch to 1.5 inches. Finally, I'm going to talk about coarse threaded versus fine threaded bolts. Coarse threaded bolts are more for industrial manufacturers. They're for framework and for building skyscrapers and other things that need a lot of heavy duty bolts. Because coarse threaded bolts have a lower quality standard and a higher margin for error, they're usually cheaper to make, cheaper and simpler to manufacture. And because they have coarser threads, they're harder to cross thread, and they're just stronger and longer lasting overall. Now fine threaded bolts do have their niche, and that's because they have the higher tensile strength of the two types of bolts. They have more grip and more root, and they're harder to back out due to from vibration and stress, making them ideal for mechanic type things and aerospace engineering. Now we're going to move on to the different types of bolts. The first type we have is the hex head bolts, and they're pretty simple. They're the most common type of bolt. You have a hexagonal head, which fits into most socket wrenches or open end wrench sets. So these are both grade 5 bolts, and you can tell by the 3 lines on top, and this one just has a longer shank than this one, and this one just is due to a higher space that you only need the threads down here, and there's usually just a filler rod right there. This one is just threaded all the way to the top. This one's more for wood or thin pieces of metal. Then you have the socket head bolt, which usually is used in like air type things and things that you just need. You only have a small space to get the bolt threaded in. So usually for these you use Allen keys like this that just fit in, and it goes and usually has a lower torque rating because of the smaller head. Then we have the continuous threads bolts or stud bolts. There's two types of these. There's ones like this that's a framing stud bolt that you put one end into concrete and you can actually bolt down the frame of your house to a concrete pad or such. And these are usually more in mechanics. It's a double-ended thread. As you can see, if you look closely, one end is fine threaded. Right there. One end is fine threaded and the other end is coarse threaded. So I think this one specifically is to bolt a carburetor to an intake manifold. Next we have a carriage bolt. A carriage bolt is actually pretty interesting. If you see right under the head, I don't know if you can tell, but right under the head there is a square piece right there. So you usually punch the square piece into wood or metal and you stick that through, and that's what actually holds the grip while you tighten the nut on the other side. These are usually most common in like truck beds and trailers where you don't want the head of a bolt sticking out, so you just have this nice rounded smooth top. Next we have a flange bolt, and the flange bolt is pretty similar to a hex head bolt. This one specifically does have a flathead screw just to be safe, but the flange bolt is specific because it has pretty much a built-in washer on the top, which is called the flange, and that just protects whatever you're bolting on from the socket or the wrench set. Then we have an eye bolt, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's a bolt you screw into something so you have an eye ring to hook stuff onto. And finally, you have a lag bolt. So this is a lag bolt. I couldn't get the washer off, but it is a gasketed washer. This was off of an older truck that I have, and it's pretty much just a flange bolt, except it does have the end of threaded end like a screw, and that's about it.